Is it a picnic table or a condiment holder? Let me show you how this little build will steal the show at your next cookout. There's a full-size pattern for this top in the pull-out section of the summer 2026 issue of Scroll Saw Woodworking and Crafts. But this is simple enough that I'm going to lay it out directly on the wood. I've already cut my pop or top to size 5.5 by 12 inches. So the next step is to establish a center line. I'm using a ruler with a center finding scale on the back. Once I get matching measurements on both sides, I know I'm right on center. I'll mark both ends, then connect those marks to draw a center line down the length of the board. Since this is 12 inches long, I'll mark the midpoint at 6 inches. This will be the center of my middle hole. The plan calls for 2.5-inch holes, but I'm going a little larger to make it easier to get the bottles in and out. So I've set my compass to 1 3/8 inches, which gives me a 2 3/4-inch circle. I'll start by drawing the center hole, then lay out the two outer holes. Rather than guess at the spacing, I went back to the pattern. The centers are 2.5 inches in from each end, which gives a nice even layout and plenty of room between the bottles. I'll start cutting with one of the ends for the picnic table. This is 4/4 poplar, and I'm using a number 7 Pegasus modified geometry blade. I'll make the inside cut first as usual. Making the inside cuts first is a good habit to get into. It doesn't matter on this piece so much, but on many patterns it's imperative that you make the interior cuts first. I always start on the inside, so I don't ever have to ask myself, which cut should I make first? I also try to make it a habit of placing pilot holes strategically. It makes no sense to have a pilot hole in the center of a large space, causing you to be far away from any cut lines. Here I drilled a pilot hole close to one of the corners. The first corner did not want to cooperate. I cut from the pilot hole to the nearest corner, backed the blade to the pilot hole, turned the workpiece 180 degrees, and then tried to back the blade into the cut I just made. When this works, this leaves me with an easy turn before I start cutting the first side of the shape. This time it didn't work, so I cut from the pilot hole to the side, made a 90-degree turn, or on how to do that shortly, and then cut to the corner. I had an easy time turning the workpiece now. After cutting a long straight line, I came to the next corner. The turn was a large angle, easy to make. I cut to the corner, kept the blade running, but backed it up slightly. The blade was now running in the curve just created, and I could easily swivel the workpiece in the direction I wanted to cut next. I cut the short, straight line, then made the next turn in the same manner. Now I can move to the exterior cuts. The first will remove material from the bottom, giving the angled picnic table legs their characteristic shape. I started the cut at the outer edge and followed the cut line to where it changed from an angled vertical to a horizontal line. This turn was a large obtuse angle, so it was easy to keep cutting, slow down a little, and swivel the workpiece to cut the long straight line that came next. That led to another angle, a mirror image of the other side, and then another angled cut down to the edge. There are two ways to make the next cut, and I'm going to choose the easier of the two. I cut along the horizontal line from the outside until I reach the point where the turn needs to be made. Rather than making the turn, I backed the blade all the way out. I started at the next outside edge and cut along the angled line until it met with the point where the first cut stopped and the scrap piece fell away. I have a quick word of advice. Starting an angled cut from an outside edge can sometimes be tricky. Just take your time to make sure the blade gets started properly. I also chose the easy way to make the next cut. The last cut left a vertical line that ended in a 90-degree turn. But rather than make that turn, I cut past it slightly and then over to the edge of the workpiece. Then I was able to start cutting again, straight across where I would have had to make the turn. Now I just had to cut a straight line, make some easy turns, cut a long straight line across the top of the picnic table, and then make a couple more easy turns. I followed the last straight line past the next turn and off the edge of the workpiece again. I made the last cuts on the second side of the table in the same easy manner as those on the other side. It was fast, easy, and yielded perfect corners. Now I can move on to the picnic table top. You can see where I laid out the lines for the 3 circles. I don't have any Forstner bits this large, and it's not likely a whole circle cutter will be available in this diameter. Besides, I'm not a big fan of hole cutters anyway. I'm still using a number 7 Pegasus modified geometry blade as it worked well on the picnic table ends. The thing you have to remember about cutting large circles on a scroll saw is that it's easy to stray on either side of the line as you cut. It looks easy, but it's not. If the irregularities are small, they won't be noticeable, but if you wander very far off the line, you'll need to touch up the circle later with a sander. I drilled the pilot holes near the cut lines because I didn't want to waste time making a large cut in the waist area, and I also wanted to start the cut as close to the line as possible, minimizing the possibility of a rough spot where the cut started and ended. The cut went smoothly, so I'm not going to show myself cutting the other 2 circles, as there's nothing new to demonstrate there. With all the parts cut, it's time to move on to the glue up. The plans called for 2 parts that were called condiment supports. I'm not sure why there are 2 rather than just 1, but I generally follow the plans closely the first time I make a project. If I like how it turns out in its cells, I consider any improvements that come to mind when I make more. I squeezed a bead of glue onto one end of the support, and then I spread it around with my fingertip. I placed it on one side of the picnic table, then did the same with the other support. I set the subassembly aside to let the glue dry for a bit before moving on to the next step. I brought a couple of medium-sized clamps to the workbench for the next step, adding the second picnic table side. I noticed that one of the pieces was in an odd angle, suggesting the wood probably had some twist or warp. I thought glue and a clamp would probably solve the problem, so I applied glue to the ends of the 2 supports and started to clamp the pieces in place. But when I tried to clamp on the second side, I realized that one of the condiment supports was a bit shorter than the other. I analyzed the problem, then clamped the shorter of the 2 into place and cut the other to the same length. I could have left out this segment where I look foolish finding the short piece of wood, but I think it's important for my subscribers to know that I still make mistakes. I believe it's impossible for a woodworker not to make mistakes occasionally, and we should own up to them when we make mistakes. Isn't almost anything else we can and should learn from our mistakes. So, what did I learn? This would not have happened if I'd followed the basic rule of woodworking: rip and cross-cut all the pieces for a project at the same time. These supports are not very big, and I should have stacked them on top of each other or set them side by side and cut both at the same time on my radial arm saw. The same technique applies to making cross cuts on the table saw. If I'd made my cuts there, I could have stacked them or used a stop block with the rip fence to ensure they were the same length. Luckily, this had an easy fix, just cutting a small corner from the end of the longer board. Sometimes the fix can be costly in terms of ruined material plus the time it takes to do things over. This is one of those times when the phrase, "you can never have too many clamps," is obvious. I used 2 medium-sized F clamps to hold the supports in place, and then I flipped the assembly over. After that, I spread glue on tops of the picnic table ends, centered the top, and added a small F clamp on each end to hold the top in place while the glue dried. The last step was to spread glue on the spots where the bench seats would rest. I added a medium-sized spring clamp to each of the 4 ends, and then I set the item aside to let the glue dry. If you enjoyed this project, and especially if you picked up a tip or 2 along the way, go ahead and give the video a like. It really helps more people find the channel. And if you're into practical woodworking projects that you can actually use or sell, consider subscribing. I'm always adding new projects. Let me know in the comments, would you make this as a gift, sell it, or make it for your own backyard? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.